The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Were the 1990s Britain's coolest decade? Writer Dylan Jones tells us why he thinks it was. Then actor and playwright Cliff Cardinal is here on his show, opening this weekend, which does the Land Acknowledgement as you've probably never seen it before. And from what it takes to run for public office to why people are abandoning their pandemic pets, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, March 10th, and that's all coming up on the agenda. For people of a certain age, Britain was never cooler than in the 1990s. That will come as debatable to some, those partial to the 1960s British invasion era, to be sure. But writer Dylan Jones lays out a pretty wide-ranging case for the 90s in his new book. It's called Faster Than a Cannonball, 1995 and All That. He spent those years as a working journalist and columnist at GQ, The Guardian, and The Sunday Times, to name just a few. And Dylan Jones joins us now on the line from London, UK. Hi, Dylan.
How you doing?
Really nice to connect with you. We are a nerdy show, so we get very impressed with research, and the research in this book is phenomenal. You spoke with 169 people, everyone from Boris Johnson, David Beckham, Steve McQueen, my favorite Spice Girl Mel B, Tony Blair, and Yoko Ono. Why did you want to document this era of cool Britannia as an oral history?
Well, I've made a virtue of oral histories, and I like the oral history as a form because it creates drama, it creates tension, because no two people's recollection of one event are ever the same. They might be similar, but they're always different, and that adds light and shade to a particular period. And it also adds a lot of insight, I think, because people's takeaway from a particular event, like I say, always has variations.
Well, you did get perspectives from the political world, the world of media, musicians, artists, and we're going to talk a little bit about those different disciplines. But if you're a fan of Oasis, you might catch the meaning of the title, Faster Than a Cannonball. What is it a reference to?
It's a reference to a song on their second album, What's the Story, Morning Glory, which was not just the biggest album of 1995 in the UK, but pretty much the biggest album culturally of the decade.
Why was 1995 especially a memorable year in Britain?
I think that most periods in pop culture, they tend to kind of reach their peak mid-decade, and that was certainly true in the 90s. It was the year where Britpop really took hold. It was the year that probably had the greatest amount of music in the 90s. And even though it was 2 years before the general election, politically there was a lot going on. Culturally there was a lot going on. It just felt like the best and most interesting year of the decade, and also a really good year to look through as a prism for the rest of the period.
And I'm guessing too, going back to the title of the book, Oasis was one of the biggest bands in the world, probably the biggest band in the UK. Is that another reason why you named the book Faster Than a Cannonball?
Yeah, I think it has a very, it immediately semaphores what the period is about, and it immediately takes people back to that period. So there's high recognition factor.
You know, I mentioned at the very beginning that the 90s, specifically 1995, was a big year for some people. But I guess when you think of Britain, for some people, the swinging era was, defined by the 1960s. So what did the Britain of the 1990s have in common with the swinging 60s?
I think a lot of cultural critics look at the 90s as some kind of echo of the 60s. And that's certainly true, both in terms of style and exuberance and entrepreneurship. But I actually think that the 90s culturally is as important as the 60s. I think that it's easy to look back at the 90s and take some of the tropes and some of the big cultural issues like Train Spotting or the Spice Girls or Oasis or Britpop, and come away with a very clear idea of what that decade meant. But it was an incredibly varied decade. There was a lot going on. And also there was a huge upsurge in working class culture. And I think if you look at the art world, the music world, even the political world, I think there was a force there that hasn't been seen since in this country.
Well, you mentioned the working class, and I want to read you part of what Noel Gallagher of Oasis said to you in the book about British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's influence on his generation. And viewer discretion, there are a few curse words in this quote, so I'll try to keep it as clean as I can. Noel Gallagher says, no one will ever admit it, but we were all Thatcher's children who got off our arses and did it for ourselves. What I mean is that this all happened in spite of Thatcherism. We were all on the dole, all on benefits, and it must have dawned on us all that we were not going to get anything and that nothing would be given to us, so we had better go and effing find a way of taking it. To me, the 90s was a lot of working class intellectuals who were not really connected, who all came through at the same time in politics, music, fashion, photography, art, sport. So if these artists from across many disciplines weren't connected, as he points out, then how were they able to become so successful?
I think because there was a very hungry and rapacious media. I think a lot of media at the time was run by people who had come out of similar situations. A lot of people like myself had spent the 80s working in style magazines, and by the time of the 90s, we were working in newspapers and were perhaps in greater positions of power. Plus, like I said, there was an incredible groundswell, whether you were in the art world, in publishing, in music, in film, and plus there was a big nightclub culture at the time. And I think you always have to remember that this was a decade without social media. This is the last analog decade where people didn't rely upon social media to propel themselves, and so consequently had to form their own communities, real communities.
You do have a quote in the book. Noel Gallagher says that. Do you think because there wasn't the internet, there wasn't this like immediate feedback loop, that maybe this allowed these artists across all disciplines a greater sense of freedom and creativity?
I think that I think these days you probably have more creativity, but I think I return to my use of the word community. Community is very powerful. And when your community is digital, it's quite diffuse, and it's difficult to harness that power. You might be able to harness the power fleetingly, but it dissipates and disappears quite quickly. And I think one of the most important things about the 90s was that creation of community and communities.
Who were the YBAs, speaking of community?
The YBAs were the young British artists, people like Damien Hirst, Mark Quinn, Tracy Emin, Sue Webster. These were people, again, who came out of a largely working class culture, who were antagonistic towards the art establishment and established themselves quite quickly as enfants terribles, really smashing against the system, and in the process created an awful lot of media fuss about themselves. But the most important thing about the YBAs, along with the most important factor of all the young British groups at the time, is that these people were genuinely talented.
Mm. Well, I'm glad you said that, because in the book, you have quotes from David Bowie, and David Bowie was a huge fan of Damien Hirst. What would you say was the appeal of these young artists?
The appeal was that they were all genuinely talented. They all had a huge amount of disrespect for the art establishment, and they were prepared to do something about it. And they sort of mobilized en masse. And so you had a genuine scene. It wasn't something that was manufactured by the media. and it had inherent worth and inherent quality. They were very, very good and still are.
Well, let's move on and talk about music, because you do cover a number of subjects in the book. Here's a picture I want to show you of Select magazine from 1993 featuring Brett Anderson from the band swayed in front of a Union Jack. Would you say that this was the beginning of Britpop?
Yeah, it was. And I think that it's very easy to look back now through a particular lens and think that any use of the Union Jack is associated with Brexit, is associated with nationalism, etc. But actually, it's a very powerful British trope. It's a very powerful cultural trope. It was used a lot in the 60s by pop artists like Peter Blake and pop groups like The Who. And it did become very associated with Britpop, which is why I think a lot of artists involved in Britpop look slightly defensively at that period, because I think they think that it somehow infers that they are being more overly patriotic. But it was used principally as a cultural thematic trope, as a backdrop to all this fantastic rebellion.
Well, because I keep thinking of like the Spice Girls, and they were wearing, I can't remember which Spice Girl, but they had a skirt of the British Union Jack. Is that, how was that received?
Well, at the time, it was received very playfully, because the Spice Girls were a very playful entity. But I think it's possible now to look back and think that it's a bit naff in the way that Austin Powers is a bit naff. But it was a very powerful statement at the time, because it was emblematic of the country, and it said, the British are coming, watch out.
Well, the two biggest bands associated with Britpop were arguably Oasis and Blur. How influential were they?
They were enormously influential, even though they were very different entities. Blur were a southern art school band, and Oasis were a northern working class band, and it was the kind of mixture of football culture and art school culture, and that fantastic clash was really what the decade was about.
So that clash, is that why they hated each other, or was this something that was kind of manufactured by the media and the fans?
Well, there was a mutual dislike, because it was the working class against the middle class, largely. But it was manipulated by the media, but it was manipulated by the music press. So it wasn't as though it was manipulated by the national press, but this helped those groups achieve notoriety. It helped those groups achieve popularity. And in the grand scheme of things, was a very effective mechanism.
We have a picture here from one of the prominent British magazines at the time, NME, and you've got on one side Blur versus Oasis on the other side. When you say it was an effective mechanism, was it an effective mechanism to sell magazines and the music?
Correct. Which I have never thought was a bad thing about pop music, because pop music was created to be popular.
We can't talk about music in Britain without talking about the Beatles. And in the book, you write about the reemergence of the Beatles after an anthology of their work was released in 1995. What influence did they have on British musicians of that decade, of the 90s decade?
Huge. And I think it's easy to forget that before the 90s, the Beatles had gone through a period of about 15 or 20 years when they weren't actually fashionable. I mean, now the Beatles are probably still the coolest band in the world, and have been for the last 25, 30 years. But there was a period from 1970 when they broke up to the mid-90s when the Beatles weren't really cool at all. A lot of them made quite naff solo albums. They disappeared from public view. There was the tragic death of John Lennon. So I think there was a period where people didn't really culturally reconnect with the Beatles. But that certainly happened in the 90s, because a lot of Britpop bands revered the Beatles. And ever since then, there's been a new Beatles product every couple of years, from the anthology to Get Back to all of these wonderful recreations of the 60s.
Well, it's interesting to hear that, and it was also really interesting to read that at some point Paul McCartney was embarrassed to be associated with the Beatles because in North America, I think the Beatles have always been one of the greatest bands. But you spoke with Yoko Ono, John Lennon's widow and an artist in her own right, and you interviewed her in the home she shared with him. How would you describe your time with her?
It was kind of like being with a very holy person. I think that it's very easy, or had been easy, to disparage Yoko Ono as a bit of a freak and as someone who had contributed to the downfall creatively of John Lennon. But actually being in her presence and also being in the apartment where they used to live was an incredibly humbling experience. And I found meeting her completely exhilarating.
Why?
Because of the lives that she had touched and the lives that had touched her, but also the way in which she talked about their relationship and the way that she talked about John's talent. And I felt it was a very precious thing.
The 90s also saw the rise of Tony Blair and the New Labour Party. How did he intersect with the Britpop scene?
Well, even though most of the interesting music and the cultural signifiers at the time happened before Tony Blair actually entered office in 1997 when he won the general election. Before that, Tony Blair and the Labour Party had co-opted the creative community, and they weren't simply doing this to be expedient. They understood that creativity was a vital life force for the country, and also that the creative classes tended to be younger, more liberal, more left-wing, and they wanted to support them because if you read the book, and it doesn't matter which chapter you read, whether you read about sport or media or music or art, politics, whatever, you will find that there's a general feeling that, as Noel Gallagher was quoted earlier, that there was a lot of these movements happened in spite of Thatcherism rather than because of it.
Well, it's interesting because David Bowie, you talked about why it was good for the politicians to be part of this scene. It helped them get the votes. It helped, I guess, up their cool factor with the younger voters. But I'm interested to see, like, what did the artists get out of it themselves? Because you talked about the YBAs being anti-establishment, but David Bowie was even presented with an award from Tony Blair at one point. What did these artists get from their association with someone like Tony Blair?
Well, I think that any artist who gets into bed metaphorically with a politician regrets it. And that's because most political careers end in failure. And I think that you can look at that famous photograph of Noel Gallagher shaking hands with Tony Blair at Downing Street in 1997, which was a gift for Tony Blair because it semaphored the fact that he had somehow made a connection with the creative community. But if you speak to Noel Gallagher now, he will think that's a mistake because the only people it really benefited were the Labour Party. It didn't really benefit Oasis. I think they were just flattered. And I think people are flattered initially by political attention and then tend to regret it in later life.
Well, you know, with years comes wisdom, I guess you could say that. But when would you say Britpop ended?
Well, it started to end after 1995, and I think that there was a general ascent to the mid-decade and then a general descent. However, I think it's very easy to look at this period and think that Britpop took over the world. Didn't really. It took over the UK. And one of the few bands to actually break out from the UK actually happened after 95, more like 96, 97, 98, which was the Spice Girls, which we were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. And the Spice Girls were a genuine phenomenon. And actually, they became the biggest British export of the 90s, bigger than Oasis, bigger than Blur, bigger than Pulp, bigger than all of them.
What do you think it was the appeal of the Spice Girls to, I guess, break that barrier?
I think it was the fact that they were the girl band, and previously girl bands hadn't really happened. It was the fact that they made great pop music. They all had great personalities. They were exuberant. They were a bit cocky, a bit cheeky, and they were fun.
You said great personalities. They were also cute. I can say that, I guess.
You can, I can't. I'm not allowed to say things like that anymore. No one is.
I want to quote the filmmaker Steve McQueen, who you also interviewed in the book. He had this to say about Britpop. He says, Britpop for me was about whiteness. It wasn't at all about possibilities or fusions. It was all about the past, nostalgia. The needle had stuck and people didn't want to go forward. Things were changing all around, like house, hip hop, and jungle. Obviously, they were afraid of the future and wanted to hold on to a past. One only has to quote Noel Gallagher, "I'm not having hip hop at Glastonbury." It's wrong. We know that Jay-Z eventually responded by singing his own version of Wonderwall at Glastonbury in 2008. Was Britpop about the past and nostalgia?
I think there were elements of it which had echoes of the 60s, both musically and stylistically. But I think as Steve said in that quote, and he was a fantastic person to interview for the book, there was so much other kind of music that was coming out of Britain at the time. Hip hop, trip hop, jungle, the remnants of the acid house days. So the 90s were very helpful as a platform for a lot of club music, for a lot of dance music, for a lot of black music, and it created for a very rich musical environment.
Dylan, do you know what I just realized? I just realized that the 90s was 30 years ago now. Time goes
crazy,
by,
right?
It goes by so fast. Looking back, how would you say the 90s influenced the Britain of today?
Well, I think that we look back upon the 90s now, perhaps in the way in the 90s that we look back upon the 60s. We look upon the 90s as a kind of halcyon period, and it was the last decade of the last century, and I think there was a sense of fiddling while Rome burned, a lot of exuberance, a lot of drug taking, and a kind of existential fear that perhaps as we ticked-tocked towards the end of the decade, that somehow this was going to be it. At the time in this country, we were all worried about something called the millennium bug, which had been driven by the media, which was this idea that as soon as we reached midnight at the end of 1999, that all the computers were going to stop, all the trains were going to stop, all the electricity was going to be turned off, and it was going to be apocalyptic. Weirdly, it didn't happen.
You've worked in this business for a very long time. You are a member of the media, but you've had the opportunity to speak to so many people across so many disciplines. What do you hope this book does for that period of time in the history of music in Britain?
I hope that it elevates it and encourages people to treat it with some respect, because one of the reasons I wrote the book is because there have been, you have to have a certain amount of arrogance to do something like this. And there are so many rubbish TV programs about the 90s that I kind of wanted to rescue it from the cultural dustbin.
Well, I hope you don't cancel me with this last question, but if you could settle the debate for us once and for all, who was better, Oasis or Blur?
Oh, that's a really tough question. I'm going to say Blur very quickly, but then I'm going to go like that.
Well, that's the end of the interview. Dylan, thank you so much. Congratulations. I don't even know how you did this. Phenomenal. Congratulations. Great job.
Thank you. Great to talk to you. Cheerio.
Before many public events in Canada, including plays and other performances, organizers make a formal statement acknowledging the historical and enduring relationship of Indigenous people to the land where the event is taking place. Over the next month, audiences in the provincial capital will experience that in a whole new way, as playwright and actor Chris Cardinal interrogates the practices in his new one-man show. It's called The Land Acknowledgement, or As You Like It. And Cliff Cardinal joins us now here in the studio. Great to meet you.
Hi, thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me.
It's lovely to have you here. Shall we play a little clip of the play before we get started?
Let's take a look. What'd you get?
We'll let you know. Sheldon, if you would, let's roll it.
They asked me to do the land acknowledgement today. I hate land acknowledgements. I find them so goddamn patronizing. You want me to come up here with my feathers and my beads, bless your little event, tell you you're woke? So I said I'd be delighted. What do these land acknowledgements accomplish, aside from making white people feel good about themselves? I am going to convince you to give your land back to the indigenous. I swear to God.
You are, first of all, very funny. Second of all, you're saying something that a lot of people obviously think right now needs to be said. So let's get into this. What's the backstory behind how this developed?
We sold tickets to William Shakespeare's As You Like It at Crow's Theatre, and we opened on the day of reconciliation. We were the only theater open after the pandemic. And I come out and do the land acknowledgement. And because it's the day of truth of reconciliation, the land acknowledgement goes on a little long. But I go on, and I go on, and I go on for 85 minutes. And at the end of the show, you don't get to see the show that you paid for.
You've done a little bait and switch with people there.
We did, absolutely. Yeah. And everyone was thrilled.
But you've got it, now that was the version that was. You've done a new version now that is just, that's out there. You're not trying to fool anyone.
That's right, we're not trying to fool anyone. It's the pure land acknowledgement, and we're at the CAA Theatre this month. Now,
when you did it the old way, and people realized, oh, okay, I get it. I'm not here to see Shakespeare. This is actually what it's about. What was the reaction?
They cheered and applauded. Also, they sent nasty letters and protested in the theater. They yelled at me and stormed out. We had a real acknowledgement of the territory that we're on.
What'd you make of that reaction?
It always helped the show, because any controversy, people come together and they go, wow, either I feel that way and I'm not going to see that show, or I don't feel that way and I'm going to go down and see it. So anytime anyone complained, it always made the show stronger, because we are in a very conflicted land, and to not acknowledge that conflict really makes it tense.
But I guess now, I mean, you can only sort of hold that secret for so long, so now you just, now you've just come right out and said, here's what the show's about, and we think you ought to see it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Back to the clip we just played a second ago. Tell us more about what it is about the sort of practice of going through the land acknowledgement that just does not sit well with you.
I think it's just wild that someone who has no connection with the Indigenous community whatsoever can stand up, say a few words, and then accept this applause as if they're John Trudell, who just made a speech. And I think that a land acknowledgement, or to pledge some sort of allegiance with an Indigenous community, you should at least have some sort of footing within that community.
You know, people mean well, though, when they applaud after hearing the end of it.
What does mean well mean?
It means they hear it and they think, yes, that resonates with me and I wish I could do something about it, but I can't, but I want to show my support.
Mean well means nothing to me, Steve. I mean, they say that for residential schools, the road to hell is paved in good intentions, but it's the road to hell.
What would you rather see in its place?
Well, it's not that I have any better suggestions. I mean, I'm still up here giving a land acknowledgement at the Mirvish Theatre. In fact, if I had any ideas, believe me, I wouldn't be doing a comedy show. I wouldn't hold back on you.
Are there people who think this is serious and you shouldn't be having any fun with it? Because you are having, I mean, you're making a bigger point, but you're doing it in a very amusing way.
Yeah, it's a theater show, so we're trying to, I'm trying to make you smile and make you laugh, win your money, and have you come back next time.
But are there people who find that inconsistent or inappropriate given the subject matter?
We try to take care of our audience, but I don't think that anyone wants to come in and be soft-pedaled the truth. We're trying to have a relationship. Maybe not to have a relationship with the entire Indigenous community, but have a relationship with me, and one that's based on honesty. Because I'm done shutting up around here.
What does that mean?
To be an Indigenous person means to be lied to. It means to be living in a world that didn't expect us. Steve, I'm supposed to be dead right now. And we're still here. And so since we're still here, we owe it to ourselves to have a laugh and to bring people together and to make the best out of this thing.
You say you should be dead by now because you have been the victim of genocide.
Because, well, the word victim is a bit ridiculous, but absolutely, this country perpetrated a genocide on Indigenous people, and they failed, and so we're here to laugh at them.
And when you say this country, you don't mean everybody, obviously, but what do you mean?
Well, no, I mean any time that you put up the flag that says Canada or a papal collar that says the church, you're talking about a colonialist enterprise who set about to kill Indigenous people.
And after people see the show, what do you want them to sort of take away? Like, do you want them to do anything?
I want them to take away less money. Because it's just more honest. I mean, I don't have anything to teach anyone. I don't know anything. And I think if I did have an agenda for what I have to say, people would be on to me. And so I think the best thing that we can do is to come together and have a good time and have a show. And maybe we get shifted in how we feel, and maybe not. But in the end, I'm still an ATM for my family.
But is there... You're funny, Cliff. I got to say, you're good. You're good.
Good, thanks. I'm really nervous.
It doesn't show. You're doing beautifully. Is there... I wonder, though, if there's a sense at the end of the day that you are actually, in your humorous way, trying to convince people to go to their politicians and say, you know what? These land acknowledgements really are kind of ridiculous, and maybe what we ought to do is actually what we say we want to do, which is to give some land back.
Go ahead and preach, Steve. I like it. I don't have these kinds of ideas, because if I really thought about something that we should do, like, what if I made things worse? What if my ideas made things worse? So absolutely, if people have ideas, people are a lot smarter than me out there. But if maybe we get the conversation going, maybe someone else will have some idea and throw it in, and we'll be better off.
Did you ever see the show Working Moms on CBC?
Oh yeah, I saw a little bit of it. I really like it.
It's Catherine Reitman's show, and there's a scene in the show where somebody gets up to do a land acknowledgement, right?
Yeah, that's
and
right.
then somebody in the audience asks a question. I mean, can we not do better than this? Should we not actually be giving the land back? And the person who gave the land acknowledgement, of course, is stuck, doesn't know what to do. That was a funny moment as well. This is becoming an issue, I guess, in more places, right? Because non-Indigenous people are coming to a conclusion that while this is a sweet thing to do, it may not actually be accomplishing very much. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. Though the one good thing about it is that by raising these issues and by having these conflicts, I'm here. And there's precedent for a lot more of my friends who are Indigenous artists. And so we're able to get into conversations that we might not have been in otherwise.
Right. Can I ask you some questions now? You, the actor.
Sure.
Okay. How many shows a week are you doing?
8.
8 shows a week.
8 shows.
So standard Broadway fare, 8 shows a week.
That's right, Broadway.
So there are some days, well, look, you're in showbiz. Are there some, a couple days a week you're doing 2 shows a day?
Yeah.
In which case, how do you not get laryngitis when you are doing a one-man show on a fairly heavy topic, and the show's 90 minutes long, and it's only you? How do you not lose your voice? Yeah, there he is. He's still being funny. Still being funny. All right.
Drink lots of water.
Is that the secret?
And rest, I guess. I've never done 8 shows a week in a big theater before, so it's going to be quite an experience for all of us.
And how long's the run?
It's 2 weeks.
2 weeks, but by the end of it, you're going to be talking like this by the end of it.
Thanks for the tip, Steve.
I'm just letting you know.
I appreciate it. From one show business hack to another.
You got that right. What happens when you haven't got a co-actor on stage with you to feed you a line if you forget a line? Mm-hmm. What do you do when that happens?
I asked the audience, what was I saying?
Seriously?
Yeah, there's a little bit of room for people to say something, because the more community is involved. A great story shouldn't shut everybody down. A great story should make you go, oh, that reminds me of a story I have to tell you. So it should be a dialogue. Even if the other person is silent, I should be able to reach out and get a hold of what we were talking about.
Have you been heckled during a show?
Oh my gosh, have I been heckled? What comedian hasn't been heckled?
So what do you do when that happens?
In this show, one thing that's good about it is that when I'm getting heckled about these issues, the rest of the audience sees the point of this show. That's why we're doing this. And so they have to choose sides about whether or not they're going to be on the side of the rich guy who doesn't like what he's seeing, or the person who's on stage who's trying to give a show. And generally, they go with me. But if you go onto the Edmonton subreddit or certain reviews, not everybody is on my side about this.
And do you get, I mean, if somebody tries to get hostile with you, obviously two approaches. One is to try to kill them with kindness, and the other is to...
Kill them with not kindness?
Exactly. Go blazing.
And
what do you do?
Well, every situation has a different, occurrence. But I have found that, like you said, not everyone is personally responsible for the genocide. I understand that Canadians didn't kill the previous owners of their homes. But I do feel that many people feel unacknowledged. Many people live in this country who would like to be acknowledged. And so if someone is in the audience and they need to be acknowledged, we will acknowledge them.
Okay. I don't know if you like this or you don't like this, so I'm going to...
Already I like it.
I'm going to walk up to this line delicately because your mom is Tantu Cardinal.
Sweet Tantu, yeah.
Yes, she is. And I remember seeing her in Dances with Wolves. I don't know how many years ago that is. It might be 40 years ago already.
Yeah.
Or not quite 40.
No. It would have been about 35,
yeah,
something
okay.
like that.
35 years ago, and north of 60. And anyway, she's, she's one of our iconic actors in this country. And that's your mom. So what have you learned from her about the business you're in?
I've learned that it's tough to be an Indigenous actor, to feed a family and to keep yourself doing work that's important to you. And so anytime I do get up in front of an audience and on stage or anywhere, it's a real honor. And so that anyone who hears my name and it becomes part of the fabric of our lives, or of all the people who've been on this stage, it means the world to me. So I want to thank you very much for having me.
Was it inevitable that you would follow in her footsteps, if I can put it that way?
Oh no, I just left the house as soon as I could reach the doorknob. But I dropped out of high school when I was 15, and I walked into the back of this bar. And there was this theater company who was doing Canadian history plays. And the director, after a few days, he kind of noticed me there. And he comes over and says, if you're asked to do anything, best to do it. Otherwise, stay out of the way. So my 10th grade year was just spent listening to actors perform comedy. And now, it was designed for me to be there. My mom told me which bar to go into. So that's there were a lot of artists around me. That was the benefit of that.
Do you go to her for advice still?
Well, I don't listen to any advice, and neither did she. So I think we're similar in that respect too.
You've got it. You've got a great sense of humor, which is why this play is going to do well, because you've got it's an important message, but you handle it in such a good and funny way.
Oh, thank you, Steve.
It's very engaging.
Thank you very much.
That's Cliff Cardinal, who's the writer and star of The Land Acknowledgement, or As You Like It. Cliff, thanks for joining us
here
at
Steve.
TVO.
All right, thanks.
The agenda this week heard why some people are giving up their pandemic pets, examined teenagers' declining eagerness for learning to drive, and checked in on India's democratic woes. The agenda's Week in Review begins with how tough it can be to run for elected office here in Canada.
Access to network, access to money, access to a machine. A lot of people think without that, you can't be successful. Todd, obviously, you had a political party behind you. You had a fundraising apparatus behind you. You had a leader who was obviously quite concerned that you win, so you had all that going for you. What machine was backing you?
I built my machine. My community was my machine. My community has shown up for me in incredible ways over the years, encouraged me, in my political aspirations in terms of advocacy and organizing.
But it's a coalition of groups, I presume, yes?
Yeah, I mean...
So who's in that coalition?
So when I first decided I was going to run, I brought together about 20 of my closest personal friends, mentors, and, colleagues, professional colleagues, to say, I'm thinking about this crazy thing, and what do you all think about this? Would you support me through this endeavor? And they were all very, supportive and enthusiastic about me taking this on. And so just knowing they had my back, it gave me the confidence to go forward, to continue to draw on and mobilize the networks that I had already been building since I was a teenager in my community through doing organizing. I had been pulling together all candidates debates and, mobilizing young people around trying to get a community center and space for ourselves to, be able to do things other than hang out with idle hands, in the neighborhood. And so, it really was an effort that took quite some time for me to identify who I could work with. There was a group called Women Win TO that was organized by former councillor, current MPP, Kristen Wong-Tam, amongst many others, including Velma Morgan, who works with Operation Black Vote Canada, was one of the founding members. And they trained a group of about 20 young women who had political aspirations in 2017 to understand what it takes to run a winning campaign. So folks like Peggy Nash, other professionals and experts in the field came through and helped us understand what it took.
I wonder if you had any of that behind you when you ran for mayor.
No.
None of that. You had no coalition or machine or something.
I'm a policy analyst. I eat policy for breakfast, and that was my advantage. I work at Toronto Metropolitan University right now, and I evaluate a variety of federally funded projects that are focused on the future of work. So it's like all I really had to do was bring the work table to the platform. And that was something that I thought was a lot easier than building a machine behind me, because I am the machine.
Knowing you a little as I do, I can confirm that. You are the machine. Yes, indeed. Okay, Todd, again, you're a little different in as much as you did have this apparatus behind you, but let's approach it from this standpoint. You can't just decide, I'm going to be the candidate for the Progressive Conservatives in such and such a riding, and therefore it happens. You actually have to earn the right to be the PC standard bearer. How do you do that? Talk to us about networks, money, access to people, organization, all that.
Well, I prefer to call all those things relationships, Steve.
Okay.
Life is about relationships. Politics is about relationships. And governing is about relationships. And it's listening more than talking. Now, what I did run for and win a seat on the school board in 1994 in Durham. And so I definitely can relate to Chloe and Amber about that endeavor, because of course you're not affiliated with a party, so you do have to put together your own team. Then when you run provincially or federally, as I have, of course you're part of a team with the leader as leading that team and leading the message. And your job is, as Jim Flaherty taught me, to be part of that team, because politics is a team sport at the provincial and federal level.
Did you run federally as well?
And I did run federally in 2019. Yes. So
you lost that one too.
Yeah. Okay. So, but Steve,
I forgot that.
as I said on election night when I won on June 2nd, I'm batting 400, which isn't bad in baseball. So 5 elections, 2 wins. That's batting 400.
I think in this province, we largely treat people's companion animals as their own problem, and we don't provide enough social support through public funding and other, public provincial mechanisms to support people in keeping their animals with them. I don't think you generally see people who want to give up animals and who feel good about that decision. I suspect a lot of abandonment has to do not only with inability to find a place for those animals to go, but also the social shame of feeling like a failure and being unable to keep that animal with you in your own home. But what we see in this province, Steve, is, and across the country, is largely governments treating these sheltering type issues as a private problem that charities should address, instead of providing, public infrastructure and really strong supports to make sure that, shelters have the capacity, that rescues have the capacity to deal with this question and this issue when people can't care for animals any longer.
So what does that look like? If in your best world, what does a more community-based approach look like?
Yeah, I think we do some public funding of some shelter operations, especially when you look at larger cities like Toronto. Toronto Animal Services receives funding for operating shelters. But most shelter and rescue operations are run on donations. They're run on volunteer power. They're run because people, out of the goodness of their hearts, believe it's the right thing to do to care for animals. And that, of course, is the case. But there's also a lot of social and public benefits that accrue from making sure that we have this public infrastructure to take in cats, dogs, rabbits, reptiles, other animals who need homes.
Reptiles?
Reptiles.
Like what?
Lizards, snakes, iguanas. These are all animals that unfortunately are still legal to keep and possess and own in most places in the country. And it's often a very challenging animal to care for. People don't typically understand or always understand the needs that those animals have, and sometimes that can lead them to want to give them up and abandon them, sadly.
Kathy, can you help me on that one? People have pet reptiles where you are, snakes, lizards, that kind of thing?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with Camilla 100%. We advocate, that pets should be included in the social safety net. And so when we're looking at supporting families, we should be looking at supporting all members of the families, including the companion animals. And that would extend to providing funding to organizations that are supporting the animals. Because of the work that Pause for Hope does, we're often working with the same families that our colleagues in social services are supporting. We're just supporting their companion animals, and they're supporting the humans. But really, we need a system that is looking at animal welfare not only as a social service, but as a social justice issue. Because what we are seeing is families that are struggling are disproportionately marginalized and don't have access to human services in the same way that they are struggling with access to animal services.
In which case, Phil, what do you need?
There's a lot that's needed on that, I think, and we're lucky at this point that the Vet Act in Ontario is up for review and revision, because the entire model of how veterinary care and access to care is delivered in the province needs an overhaul. It's an antiquated and dated system, and it's preventing right now solutions that could make care more accessible to individuals and pets and families from existing. The last major review happened in the late 80s. And it's time to not only be caught up, but also to be forward-looking and evaluate the models that can make care accessible. We focus a lot on sheltering and reactionary programs, which are necessary because the preventative programming and the preventative services aren't there to support people before they hit their breaking point and before those animals end up without anywhere else to go.
I'm sure most people watching this don't understand the nuances of what you're trying to advance here right now, but is it a question of what? More storage, more care, more what?
I think it's more capacity within the industry. Care providers within the veterinary industry across the country, there's a national shortage. Right? There's not enough veterinarians, there's not enough veterinary technicians and other paraprofessionals to deliver the services to the volume of animals that exist.
Kylie, when you got your driver's license, how old were you?
I was 19.
You were 19. You waited 3 years. How come?
I started with a few lessons from a private teacher, and I felt that I hadn't quite learned enough to confidently drive out on the road, so I did another round of lessons.
Gotcha. Teresa, how old were you?
I was 16. I got my license on my 16th birthday.
On the day?
Yeah, absolutely.
As one did back then?
Yes, of course.
Not that it was so long ago, but that's what I did too. Sean, how about you?
16th birthday, I was there getting my 365, and I had my full G shortly thereafter.
365, that's what we used to call it back in the day. What did that mean anyway?
It was valid for a year. It was the equivalent of a G1 and allowed you to drive with a supervising driver.
Got it. Okay, pick up the story. Why does there seem to be this delay, this situation where no longer, 16-year-olds are out there on their birthday grabbing their driver's license as soon as they possibly can?
I have to speculate. My wife doesn't drive. She doesn't have her license. I tried to get her to take her the program, but it didn't work out. She never needed it. She lived on a transit line. Everything was so accessible, and across the street from where she lived was the grocery store. It just wasn't a need. And why spend the money on something that you're not going to use?
Teresa, what do you think's going on?
I think there's a number of things, right? Social media or mobile phones have replaced the need to see each other in person. My 15-year-old son can play games and connect with his friends all through a microphone and headset and not have to be in the same room to socialize, I think is one aspect. Cost is another. It's expensive, and parents are driving their kids longer.
Kylie, you told us about your own personal circumstances, but look society-wide now. What would you add to the list of reasons why kids are not out there getting their driver's license as soon as they turn 16?
Well, at least in BC, we have to go through an L learner's permit and then an N and then a full license. So a full license I got when I was 19, and getting your L you can get when you're 16 in BC. These tests cost money, and a lot of young people in this generation are struggling with money, and everything is just costing so much. They simply cannot afford to get a vehicle or afford the insurance or even afford to take the test to get your license.
Let me follow up with, okay, admittedly a bit of a tricky question here. You were in an accident once upon a time, yes?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yes, I was in an accident in 2011. I was 8 years old at the time, and I still struggle from the aftermath of that crash. I have chronic neck and back pain that will stick with me for the rest of my life. And along with that came a concussion at the time, whiplash, and I now deal with PTSD. So,
my goodness, I'm so sorry to hear that, but would you say that's part of the explanation why you were not so gung-ho to get out there and get your license right away?
Yeah, it was scary, I guess, because when you're that young, you feel completely safe around adults. The adult is driving, they know what they're doing, you have your complete trust in them, and to have that broken is hard to get over, and especially when it's now your turn to be the adult that needs to have control over the situation, and you are now responsible for the other people in the vehicle. It's a lot of responsibility, and it's a little scary.
Given what you've just heard, what do we conclude about whether Prime Minister Modi is in fact governing in the way that one would expect the leader of a democracy to govern in? What do you say?
Well, I would have to say, Steve, that we need to take a long view of this, of democracy in India. And it's not that, the story starts with Mr. Modi. Go back to 1947, many people believed India wouldn't survive as a democracy. Churchill famously thought India would collapse and implode and couldn't govern itself. And yet India has had election after election, every election bigger than the last. Everyone is a feast of democracy. So clearly India's gotten that right, elections right. Now what happens in between elections, that's a different matter. I would say on this notion of electoral autocracy, there's a bigger point here, Steve, which is that our Westminster system, unfortunately, for good or ill, is prone to majorities in Parliament essentially being able to do what they want within the limits of a constitution, a Supreme Court oversight, and so forth. So this problem of a strong majority in Parliament, meaning you can pretty much do what you want, is not unique to India. We've seen it in Canada, we've seen it in the UK. So I take somewhat exception to the notion that this is sort of a problem unique to India or to Mr. Modi.
All right, I got to get the guy with the Democracy Forum to come in on that. What do you conclude about the way Modi is governing? Is it consistent with how one would expect a democratic leader to govern?
Well, I think, Vivek is absolutely right that we should look at one side of the ledger, which is the elections. In the 2019 and 2014 election before that, more people voted in India than ever before, roughly 66% of the electorate. For the first time, you had parity of men and women voting. There was even a higher turnout amongst those who belong to the Dalits and Adivasi communities in India. So there's a great deal of vibrancy in the electoral space. But on the other hand, what we've seen in India, and I think it's true, we should put it in comparative context, we've seen across the world democratic backsliding, south of the border, of course, Brazil, Hungary, Turkey. In Britain, we've seen the rise of the far right in many countries. So what we're seeing is increasing majoritarianism in our politics, more resurgent nationalism, a more exclusionary understanding of who's a citizen. And that has happened in India. And I think we could have a debate about this or a discussion about this. I do think what's happened in India has been quite striking. There's been a real concentration of power in the hands of the Prime Minister's office. The cabinet and parliament are much weaker than they used to be. India had coalition governments for 25 years. There's a lot more power sharing. And so I do think that something has happened in India which is quite striking. It's not unique to India, but because it's the world's largest democracy, and because it is an emerging power, it matters more in the world. And I think that's why a lot of people are drawn attention to it.
Shaker, I should get you on the same question. What do you think?
Well, yes, there's a trend. There's a worldwide trend. If you look at the state of the world, you can go clockwise or anti-clockwise. I used to say it more emphatically until a couple of years back. And I said, look, go either any which way, you will see, if you go clockwise, you see Trump, then you see Putin, Xi Jinping, Shinzo Abe, Narendra Modi, Erdogan, Netanyahu, and Orban and Bolsonaro. And when you got bored, there was always Duterte, right? Now some of those have gone. Trump has gone, a couple of the others. Netanyahu has gone and come back. But generally, the trend right now is that in elected democracies, where genuine elections take place, I'm not talking about, say, in this case, about China or Russia, them included though, there is a trend that strong men of the nationalist right are taking power, and people seem to like them.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, TVO.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, March 10th, 2023. When does something like helping out a friend cross the line and become an example of corruption? Monday, we'll explore that in politics and in everyday life. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at TVO.org. Have a great weekend. And Steve, we'll see you again on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.